Jennifer Robinson is a formidable attorney, human rights advocate and champion for freedom of expression. When did finding justice and giving back become so important to you?
It's always been important to me and to my family. I was brought up with the ethos that you give to people who are less well off than us.
Known globally for her work on some of the most high-stakes legal cases of our time.
Today is a historic day. Julian Assange can go home a free man.
How did you get to work on his case?
I was introduced to Julian through my mentor. I was at a very young age on one of the biggest cases in the world. What I've learnt about the way that power operates is really interesting, and the limits of the law, actually.
Jennifer also shares her experience working on the Amber Heard case.
How does someone like her in the aftermath move through that?
Any survivor who has been through a court case where they're cross-examined in front of the public will tell you how traumatic that is. Amber had to do it twice. She's suffering lasting trauma as a result of it.
We further discuss high-profile cases like Harvey Weinstein.
1 in 3 women will suffer sexual violence, 1 in 4 domestic violence in this country. It's in our interests to end this epidemic of violence against women, but that begins with us being able to speak about it.
I'm Sarah Grynberg, and this is A Life of Greatness. Jennifer, you grew up in the regional town of Berry in South Coast, New South Wales, and now you are the human rights lawyer to some of the biggest cases in the world. When did finding justice and giving back become so important to you?
It's always been important to me and to my family. I was brought up with the ethos that you give to people who are less well off than us. And that was always sort of one of the values I was brought up with, I guess. But for me, it was really my interest in human rights in particular was sparked when I went to Indonesia when I was a student at high school, and then later went to live there as a uni student. So I studied Indonesian studies at a rural and regional high school, which is a testament to the Australian government's policies. And that took me on my first trip overseas. As a kid, we didn't travel overseas, and so I got to go on this trip overseas, and I saw what I saw, particularly working in West Papua, working with Indigenous communities there. I've been interested in what was happening through my studies of East Timor. I was at high school, finishing high school at a time when Australia led the peacekeeping force into East Timor to put an end to Indonesian war crimes and crimes against humanity. So I was interested in that subject matter. And I went out to this place in Indonesia called West Papua, which is unlawfully occupied by Indonesia, and worked with the local communities there, documenting the crimes of Indonesian military and police against the Indigenous population. And it was what I saw there that really changed my life and made me realise that what I really wanted to do was be a human rights lawyer. From what I saw, I represented a political prisoner who was in prison for his political beliefs, who was a leader of the movement for self-determination. I helped him and his family escape the country, and I've worked with him ever since. And it was really that time on the ground seeing firsthand the injustices that I saw in West Papua, the crimes being perpetrated by the Indonesian military. When I saw that for myself, I knew then that I wanted to work as a human rights lawyer, and I could see the difference that my legal skills were making just in that context before I'd even finished my law degree. So it was something that really sparked my interest in doing this work in different parts of the world and here at home.
Let's go back to your days at Oxford University where you studied.
I came from a public school. I'm very proud public school alumni. I went to Berry Public School, Bomaderry High School. So turning up at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, I felt an immense pressure about what I was going to do with my career. How could I possibly live up to the expectations of what it means to be a Rhodes Scholar? But also in that experience, coming from a rural and regional public school, ending up in this very privileged academic environment, I was sat next to kids from Eton and Harrow, some of the most famous private boys' schools in the world. And the obstacles, the discrimination that we face as women in the law, and as someone from a different background being at Oxford, there are very real structural obstacles that mean I was one of the only women in the room, one of the only women from a public school in the room. And that affects our experience of life. When we're the first people doing these things, I'm the first Rhodes Scholar from Bomaderry High, I'm the first Rhodes Scholar from the south coast of New South Wales. When you're the first person to be doing things, you come up against these structural barriers and obstacles as women of colour, even worse. And so understanding that there are these structural obstacles that are in our way and that we come up against, the privileges that we see other people enjoy that we haven't had, that enable them to be where they are. It's not that I don't think that I belong or that I'm not good enough to be there. It's that when you're the only person from a public school who's sitting in that room, there is a sense of you're pushing a mantle, you're doing something new. And so I think it's important to think about it in that context. So rather than imposter syndrome being about us as women, there being something wrong with us that we don't feel like we belong, actually so much about what we're confronted with tells us we don't belong and tells us that we haven't been in these rooms for very long. And one of the best stories I can give you about that is my coming up dinner at Balliol College. The Vice Regent gave a speech to welcome us all, and it was like, welcome to Balliol, you are the creme de la creme, we're the top academic college, we've had Nobel Peace Prize winners, look around the room, there's portraits of all these white men who had been prime ministers and Nobel Prize winners. And then they said, oh, and we let women in some time ago. So look around, men, you could be sitting next to your future wife. And it was like, I thought, wow, I've worked so hard to be here. And we're being treated as if we're marriage fodder as women scholars at one of the best colleges at Oxford. And that's the kind of language and the kind of experiences that I came up against in the law and at Oxford, which we weren't treated the same. We weren't treated equally. We weren't treated like we belong there. We weren't. And so it's not that I don't feel I belong. I'm told I don't belong. I'm told that there's a different way in which I'm treated to the man sitting next to me. And I think that's what we have to acknowledge.
Mm. Do you feel that anything's changed since, or it's still like that?
I think I have to say, my experience at Balliol College was excellent. And so that coming up speech was an exception. Things are changing. Things are changing in the law, but they're not changing fast enough. So when I was, for example, when you're a young lawyer starting out, I remember being at a law firm in Sydney and all of the kids around me had been to private schools, every single one. I was the only kid that had been to a public school. And when you're constantly the only person in the room, a woman, public school educated, in these very privileged rooms, I started thinking, why is that? Why is it this way? But if you look at the history of the Rhodes Scholarship, for example, it's incredibly male-dominated. I mean, we were only allowed to become Rhodes Scholars as women in 1975 after they passed legislation in the UK, after the Sex Discrimination Act, to make it a requirement that women could also be Rhodes Scholars. So it's only in post-1976 that women could become Rhodes Scholars. So it's actually relatively recent. And at the time, for example, Malcolm Turnbull won the scholarship, Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. 25% of all Rhodes Scholars had come from his school, Sydney Grammar, a boys' school. And so it shows like the history of the scholarship that I was on at Oxford is incredibly male-dominated. Historically, it was only for men. And the numbers still reflect that. I was one of 3 women from Australia, our year that we went through, 3 of 11 who were women, and one of the few from a public school. So my question is, why is it when the majority of Australians who go to public schools, why are we not represented in the majority as the majority of people in these rooms? And that tells you how privilege works. And so I have managed to traverse that, and people are surprised by my trajectory. It's an unlikely trajectory to go from a kid from rural and regional Australia in public schools to Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford to having the career that I have internationally. That is unlikely, particularly as a woman. And so the fact that people talk about me experiencing imposter syndrome, it's not that I've worked really hard to be there. I know how hard I've worked to be there. Women should be there. Women from public schools should be there. And the fact that it's so unlikely and I'm seen as such an outlier shows you the obstacles that we have to getting there. And so it's not about anything that's in me. It's about the society that we face and the obstacles we have to overcome to be in those rooms.
Hmm. After 14 years, you helped Australian Julian Assange become a free man. For those that don't know him, he was the founder of WikiLeaks. He had published at the time evidence of war crimes, human rights abuse, as well as a host of other things. And for a lot of people, he was the poster boy for free speech. And I wonder, how were you able to prove him innocent?
Well, Julian Assange is a publisher. He was being criminalised and prosecuted for engaging in protected journalistic activity. So with WikiLeaks, Julian does what journalists do all the time. He received and published public information in the public interest that the public deserves to know. Evidence of war crimes, evidence of human rights abuse. This is journalistic activity. So when you say proving him innocent, he was being criminalised for performing his job as a publisher and a journalist, something that should not be a criminal offence. So it's a very long story. Obviously, it's gone on for 14 years, but we were able to secure his release this year after he pled guilty to an offence under US law. So he effectively had to plead guilty to committing journalism. So we had to, the US government wanted to see him in prison for the rest of his life. He faced 175 years in prison for the very same publications for which he's won the Sydney Peace Prize, the Walkley Award for Most Outstanding Contribution to Journalism, and the publications of publishing the Guantanamo Bay manuals, which showed the way the US is using torture in Guantanamo, the Afghan and Iraq war logs showing US abuses, and in the context of those wars, and the sheer number of civilian casualties that weren't properly being reported, the state diplomatic cables, which showed human rights abuse and corruption the world over, and the way that US diplomacy actually works. It was of mass public significance, but they wanted to send him to prison for the rest of his life, 175 years in prison. And in the end, after 14 years of legal battles, and with the support of the Australian government, we were able to secure a negotiated outcome, but it required him, for his freedom, to plead guilty to an offence. And I say he pled guilty to committing journalism. So he had to plead guilty to violating the Espionage Act in the United States, which the New York Times and Washington Post has said is criminalising public interest journalism. But it meant that he was out with time served and the US can't prosecute him for anything else. So it's a better outcome than we would have received in the courts, and one that was long, hard fought, and is really a product of the incredible global movement for free speech that rose up behind Julian and to support him and our efforts. The political effort, the grassroots campaigners here in Australia who knocked on the door of their MP, who put pressure on our parliamentarians, who got the Australian government, helped us get the Australian government on side, and the very principled decision of our Prime Minister Albanese, to make this a priority and to make clear to the US that Australia wanted him home. So it was a combination of many things that allowed us to negotiate this outcome to bring him home. And it's honestly, it's one of the most rewarding and satisfying outcomes in my career to have touched down in Australia with him on that plane, and to see him reunited with his family, and to see him get his life back after what has been a horrendous 14 years of imprisonment, persecution, and I mean, they took his life from him. So for me, that he's now home in Australia and with his kids on the beach is, incredibly rewarding.
How is he now?
He is taking his time with his kids, and I'm really pleased that the media is respecting his privacy and he's getting this quiet time. Many Australians might have seen that he appeared in the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly addressing Parliament about what happened to him, but that's the only public appearance he's done. And in that appearance, he spoke about how he's still recovering and it's still very difficult for him. And as his wife, Sarah Assange, said, freedom comes slowly. So the fact that he's out of prison, he's still adjusting to so many of the impact on his mental and physical health and his perception from having been imprisoned for so long. And just little things that people don't think about. When we're on the plane taking off from the UK, I was sitting next to him on the plane, and he was just constantly looking out at the horizon, and he kept saying to me, Jen, I haven't seen the horizon for 15 years. For 14 years, or whatever it's been. When the plane was about to take off, the engines, it was interesting. He said, I haven't felt, and it was such a small little thing, these little things that we take for granted in our lives, that for him, he hadn't been into a shop for over a decade, because he'd been in the Ecuadorian embassy and then in a high security prison. So I don't think anyone can really comprehend what that might feel like, coming back out into the world after being so isolated. But he's doing well, and as well as we could expect. And I'm just pleased that he's having this quiet time with his family and reconnecting with Australia and with nature. He's, enjoying the things that he used to ask me about in prison when I'd come home to Australia, and he'd want to hear stories of my time at home and my time on the beach and the things I was up to. And it was really heartbreaking to tell these stories of home, and a home that is both of our homes, Australia, but a home he couldn't enjoy. And so the fact that he's back doing that now is so great.
How did you get to work on his case?
I was introduced to Julian through my mentor, but it's interesting, just before, I'd been following what WikiLeaks was doing back in 2010, this is going back a long time, and I was interested in what they were doing. So they were publishing, they'd published the Guantanamo Bay files, and as a human rights lawyer, I was watching it. I also defend journalists and media organisations, so I was watching what they were doing, the things they were publishing, and they were making really brave decisions. They were publishing very interesting information, and information that was so important to the human rights accountability movement. And I was following this, and I remember my mentor, Jeffrey Robertson, calling me saying, Jen, what do you know about this guy from WikiLeaks, Julian Assange? And I said, well, he's Australian, like us. So my mentor is Jeffrey Robertson Casey, who's a famous Australian human rights barrister in London. And he said, well, we should get in contact with him. And I said, well, I'm pretty sure Julian Assange doesn't have a mobile phone. And it was interesting. He then wrote an op-ed for the Australian media saying, Julian Assange has just published this information with WikiLeaks. It's very important from a human rights accountability point of view. But the US government has already arrested the source and is criminally investigating these publications. So Julian Assange, who's an Australian citizen, needs our support. And if the US government goes for him, needs support. And this is a free speech question. And interestingly, some months later, he got in touch. He'd obviously seen the article, got in touch and reached out to us about representing him. And that was I met him first in September 2010. So I've been his lawyer for over 14 years and his longest serving lawyer. So It was very satisfying to be there at the beginning and to see it through to the end.
How did covering his case change you as a person?
In so many ways, Sarah, in so many ways. Being around someone so principled and courageous, I think made me more courageous in myself and as a lawyer, as a person. I've learned so much through what I've seen in this case. It's an unprecedented case. As a lawyer, I started on this case when I was 28.
Oh, wow.
So I was at a very young age on one of the biggest cases in the world, where I've had to traverse so many political situations, geopolitics, legal cases in different jurisdictions. At some point, we were managing lawyers. I was managing a team of lawyers in 10 different jurisdictions, working on the range of cases that we were running to defend Julian, to protect him from extradition, and the various other cases that sprung up around that. So it's been absolutely fascinating. I've got a front row seat at one of the most fascinating and controversial cases of our time. It's, as a lawyer, the way that it's developed the skills that I have in terms of managing very complex legal cases, getting across lots of areas of law, understanding how law and politics and the media fit together, which is a very specific skill set, which I think is kind of amazing. But as a person, and what I've learned about the way that power operates is really interesting, and the limits of the law, actually, in cases like this, which is quite a, I think for many lawyers is quite challenging and confronting, because as in the end, and I said this publicly and I was right, this case was incredibly politicized and it required a political resolution. And while we negotiated that plea deal only happened and was made possible because of the changing politics around us and the fact the Australian government supported it. And understanding that and understanding how that works, I think makes me a much better lawyer.
That's so interesting. I was fascinated by the case, and I actually, I think a lot of Australians were, most of them, was so happy to see justice happen for Julian, because it just went on for such a long time. And as an outsider, I actually thought that there's no way that he'll get out, not because of anything he's done, just because when the US got involved, and I just thought, oh God, the poor guy. So it's incredible to see that the result in the end was very positive for him and for for what he stands for. What do you think will be different now because of his case in the way that free speech is allowed in this world and the way that I suppose people can use free speech?
I hope that this case gives the impetus that the free speech movement needs and governments need to better protect journalists. the problem with Julian's case is that the Espionage Act does criminalise journalism, and no lawyer in the United States can in good faith advise their clients when they're engaging in national security journalism that what they're doing does not violate the law. And my point and the point is, people say, well, yes, the law says this, but they're not going to go for you because you're a journalist. I said, well, the law, we shouldn't be asking journalists to have to technically violate the law to do their jobs. We should be ensuring that the legal protections, that they are protected legally when they engage in their work. You cannot, and I've spoken to my media law colleagues in the US, they can't advise their clients. They have to be able to say to these journalists, you are technically violating the Espionage Act by doing this, but the US government probably won't go for you, so it should be okay. That is unacceptable. Journalists should be able to do their jobs without the threat of criminal prosecution. And I hope that what happened to Julian means that it creates a conversation about change so that we can better protect journalists, so that this never happens to anyone ever again. Because the fact is, Julian is a journalist and a publisher. He just did it on such a scale that it shook the US government to their core. And they went for him because of that. They wanted to make an example of him. But that is setting a precedent for all other journalists. So I hope it creates change. But I also think it's a really, like you said, it was really wonderful to see how positive the reaction was here in Australia to us bringing Julian home. Like you, I mean, lots of people told me for a long time, Jen, this is impossible. Why do you stick at it? Why do you keep going with this? He's never going to get out. The US is after him. They want to see him in prison for the rest of his life. The fact that we managed to get him out is a huge win. And people should feel hopeful and positive about that, taking on the most powerful country in the world and in effect winning because he's home and it's over. And I think that's what I saw when I got back, and it was really lovely. Like the response, people would spot me on the street and want to stop me and say thank you. I had people send me bottles of champagne in restaurants when I turned up in restaurants because people were so happy. They needed a hopeful story of you can take on powerful interests and you can win. And this kind of lovely that, it's important to show that when you also having stuck at it for so long, that we achieved the outcome that I always believed was possible. And I had to believe was possible because I couldn't imagine living in a democracy or a world where an award-winning Australian journalist was in prison for the rest of his life. What does that say about our democracy? I couldn't accept that is the kind of democracies that we live in right now. And now it's over, I think we have to ask the question, this is what I kept saying, I always believed it was possible. But the question was always, how long will it take to get him out? And what will that say about our democracies and our legal systems? It took 14 years. And honestly, I think like our kids and their kids will look back at this time and think, how on earth did that go on so long? How was that even possible? And what does that say about us and about our society? So it's both a terrifying story about how government wields power and how they can wield power and how fragile our democracies and our rights really are when you come up against powerful interests. But the fact that we won in the end and he's home is such a positive story about what's possible when people campaign, when people work together, when there is a global movement to try and stop something. It can work.
Yeah.
And it did work in this case.
It's so true. You have been a very powerful voice for women, and you have your book, How Many More Women, which has just been re-released. Within that book, you talk about, the cases that have kind of come to light at the moment, which were getting away with a lot of stuff before. It was kind of silencing women within the media, people like Jeffrey Epstein. Yeah. It seems like a lot of these stories or a lot of the abuse that was going on for such a long period of time is suddenly coming to the light. And, for the darkness that these men have created and the crimes that they have done, they're not being protected anymore like they were. And I'm sure we will see more and more of these cases. I wonder, from your experience, why do you think it's taken this long for justice, for people to see the true colours of these men?
Well, the way I come at it and through our book, How Many More Women, is what I've seen in the way that the law silences women from speaking out and survivors and victims from speaking out. So in the sort of post-Me Too world, we saw this sort of breaking of the cultural silence. So it's been a taboo to speak out publicly about your experience of violence. And suddenly with Me Too, we saw a breaking of that. So the shame shifting from the survivor and victim to the perpetrator. We shouldn't feel shame as victims and survivors in speaking out publicly. The shame is with the perpetrator. And actually, let's start speaking out about it so it stops. And that was the huge thing that we saw with Me Too, this breaking of the cultural silence. So historically, people didn't speak about it. Now they were. And then what we saw was this legal backlash. And so defamation claims, non-disclosure agreements, all the ways in which survivors were being either sued, contracted to suit, or being sued into silence. And contracted to silence or sued into silence. And we've seen this happen, like in the R. Kelly example, for example, there was lots of young Black women who were making accusations against him. And he continually settled and then had them sign non-disclosure agreements. And I think, or if we look at Harvey Weinstein, non-disclosure agreements with all of the women many of the women who he is alleged to have assaulted, which kept them in these cones of silence, or the raft of defamation claims. So what I see in my practice was this huge legal backlash, and we've written about it. And so many of these powerful men who the Me Too movement made these legal tools that had been used for so long, made them more visible, because suddenly people were speaking more, and we started seeing more of these legal tools being used to reinforce the silence that had been broken. And that's part of the problem. And what we talk about is that, take the Brittany Higgins case, for example. She chose to speak out about her experience of rape in Parliament, and that was absolutely in the public interest. It sparked law reform conversations, workplace law changes, improved the situation for women working in Parliament and in workplaces around the country because of what she's standing up to tell her story. But there've been no less than 14 defamation cases and claims coming out of her decision to speak out. And I see all the time in my practice women who are scared to speak out publicly because of the risk of being sued, or do speak out, and when they're sued, the cost risk and the stress of having to defend those proceedings means people are self-censoring. Journalists are self-censoring. They might get stories. I mean, so many stories about R. Kelly, P. Diddy, Harvey Weinstein were actually making their way to the media, and people wouldn't report it because of the threat of litigation. Jimmy Savile, for example, mass pedophilia, child abuse, and women abuse allegations against someone, that didn't come out until he died because he kept threatening everyone with defamation. And so they didn't report the story. So what we talk about in the book is having to talk about the way these legal tools are being used to suppress public interest conversations and speech about gender-based violence. And our theory is, in writing the book, and our thesis and why we wrote the book, is that we can't begin to grapple with violence against women if we can't talk about it. We don't understand the extent of the problem. How can government even begin to make policy or properly fund those policies if we don't know the extent of it? And this is the thing, like we see these big cases in the public domain, P. Diddy, Harvey Weinstein, and others before that. But actually, the statistics are scary. It's 1 in 3 women will suffer sexual violence, 1 in 4 domestic violence in this country. And for all the people that say that's not all men, sure, but it's a significant number of men who are committing these crimes. And we have to be able to talk about it. It's the most prolific human rights abuse in the world. We all want it to stop. It's in our interests to end this epidemic of violence against women, but that begins with us being able to speak about it. And if we can't speak about it without the threat of legal action, then that's the legal system is enforcing a silence which is against the public interest.
Yes, that's why the conversation is so important. You represented Amber Heard in her case against Johnny Depp. That obviously became an absolute media circus. How was that for you on such a public-facing trial that the two of them had?
It was horrific. Well, there's two cases. The important thing to remember, there's 2 cases. I represented Amber in respect of the defamation proceedings that Johnny Depp took against a newspaper in the UK saying that she lied. And we won that case. So I worked with Amber and the newspaper to prepare the evidence that went before a judge, and the judge found that Johnny Depp had been violent towards her on 12 separate occasions, including an incident of sexual violence. And there's a written judgment, and I encourage people to go and read it. But when all of that evidence was put before a judge in the UK, on a more difficult standard of proof than in the US, the judge found that he had been violent towards her. I remember saying to Amber at the time, he had also sued her personally in the United States, and I said to her, we have just won this case on a more difficult standard of proof. You should, on the law, get an easier time in the US court. So the fact that we've won in the UK means he will lose in the United States because the law demands it. The standard of proof demands it because we've already proved it to a higher standard. It should be easier for you in the US courts. And her legal team there lost it. And I think it comes down to, like you said, trial by TikTok. You have a lay jury, not a judge, deciding the facts, who had put to them all of the worst male-centric myths about gender-based violence, all the tropes we hear and we try to educate kids against. You know, the things you hear about, well, if it's true, why didn't she leave him? There's a range of reasons why women stay with men who hit them and who protect them from the police because they're trying to protect their partner and they just want to try and help them get better and make it stop, but they love them, so they don't want to leave them. All these kinds of misunderstandings and tropes about domestic violence that we saw played out. And then, of course, the online space. So this was live televised to the world where people were cutting up snippets of it and putting it out in the most critical ways. And I really challenge people, a lot of people, because they know I represent Amber, you know, everybody was Team Amber or Team Johnny. And I'll have people say, oh, well, Jen, I watched the trial and she didn't come across well. And I said, did you really sit down and watch a month of trial? I don't think you did. So you're telling me you watched the snippets that you saw on social media and the impression you got from the snippets you saw on social media was X or Y. I worked on the evidence. I prepared that case. I can tell you why the judge reached that outcome in the UK. Question your perception of the truth as it's presented to you on social media. But unfortunately, I think that did sway the jury. And I think the way the case was presented swayed the jury. And I think it is an example of what we know from the criminal justice system. There is ample evidence from jury trials in the criminal justice context where if you don't educate jurors against the awful stereotypes about domestic violence and gender-based violence, it denies women justice in the courts. Perpetrators get off before juries when they're fed all the cultural biases and stereotypes about gender-based violence. And that's what I think happened in this case. And that's how you explain those two different outcomes. But the other thing I say to people, because everybody saw the US trial, like as you said, Sarah, it was everywhere. It was all over the internet. You couldn't pick up social media and not be sort of bombarded with it. There were more hashtags. There were more posts on Instagram, hashtag Justice for Johnny Depp, at that time than there were about the war in the Ukraine,
Wow.
which was the biggest news story in the world at that time. There was something happening in the online space that didn't make sense to me. There was clearly an effort in pushing pro-Johnny content. And we saw things like the way people monetized it online. Right-wing outlets were putting money into pro-Johnny content because of this sort of broader culture war about women speaking out about gender-based violence. And so I think all of this played in. But the thing I say to people is, look, I know that I know a lot about it because I worked on the facts. But the thing I say to people who don't have the benefit of the perspective and the knowledge and the access to the evidence that I had is forget all of that. All I want you to think about is 1 in 3 women have suffered sexual violence, 1 in 3 women will suffer domestic violence. Likely people we all know who have never spoken out about their experience. Do you think they'll ever come and speak to you about what happened to them if they heard the way you spoke about Amber and this case? If they saw your social media posts saying awful things about Amber, she's a liar, she's a gold digger, she's not crying the right way, she doesn't look like a survivor to me, all these stereotypes about who's the perfect victim, who's a real, quote unquote, real victim, do you think that they'll ever come to you with their own story? And the answer is no, they won't. And what it concerns me about this whole case, for me it was winning the case with her in the UK for the newspaper and proving that happened was one of the most rewarding moments in my career. That Amber got that validation from a judge. He said, I believe you. I've looked at the evidence. I believe you. And I remember saying to her at the time, great. People can't question you anymore. We proved it. There's a long, articulated legal judgment that goes through all the evidence, that weighs up the evidence, that points out all the evidence that supports you and why he concluded that. People can't question you anymore. But they did. And then her losing in the United States, watching that was devastating, one of the most devastating moments in my career. How on earth could something that I know we proved be turned, those facts turned on their head and overturned in that horrific way, in such a public way? That was one of the most devastating moments in my career, seeing that happen. But talking about this and the impact that that whole public space and social media campaign against her, it made me realize how far we have to go as a society when it comes to gender-based violence and how we speak about women. And I never want another woman to go through that. It goes to show how much work we have to do. And that's why I'm so passionate about our book, How Many More Women, and about speaking about these issues, because we have to make sure that we do better. Because what I'm seeing in my practice and from women, from other lawyers who work with women survivors, is a lot of women are now not willing to come forward because they're scared no one will believe them. And I've even had stories from my lawyer colleagues where perpetrator men have threatened their partner from coming forward to take action because don't be an Amber, no one's going to believe you. Look what happened to Amber Heard. And to me, we have to address that cultural moment and turn it into a public conversation about why we need to do better, why we need to better support women to come forward so it never happens again. So it's like the ultimate silencing that I think, and the global silencing that will be having for women everywhere is devastating to me, and why I will keep talking about it.
I wonder, Amber having to go through all that and for it to be filmed and, for people, what it seemed like everywhere talking about it at the time. How does someone like her in the aftermath move through that to be able to regain her confidence and know that her story does matter and that there are people that do support her, even though it seemed like there was a landslide of people that, from a media perspective, as you mentioned, that didn't?
I want to recognise that there are a lot of people that support Amber. And what's interesting is that we're seeing more and more reflection on what, again, like Julian's case, more and more reflection on what happened in retrospect to understand that. The amount of support I see for Amber when I am out and about with our book talking about this is huge. And a lot of people have said to me, a lot of women who spoke out in support of her online actually were targeted. I was targeted, other women were targeted who spoke out to support her. And we have to look at this, at the security and safety of the online space for women to participate in public conversations like this. But for Amber, any survivor who has been through a court case where they're cross-examined in front of the public will tell you how traumatic that is. Amber had to do it twice. And the second time, live broadcast to the world, where issues that she never wanted to speak about again. Remember, he sued her and the newspaper. She didn't want any of this. She didn't want to expose any of this to the public. She didn't want to expose the things that happened in their relationship because she, as she said in her own witness evidence, she wanted to protect him and she was embarrassed. She didn't want the world to see what she'd put up with. And so for her, it's the trauma of having to go through that twice. She chose to withdraw from the appeal in the US, which I think she would have won, because one of the outcomes, had she won that appeal, was for a retrial and the idea of going through that a third time. So anyone who has been through that process will know how traumatic it is. She is suffering lasting trauma as a result of it. And the public shaming online for her was like nothing we've ever seen before in this day and age. And I don't want to see another woman go through it, which is why I think we need to talk about it and why I think we need to have better protections. I hope that one day she'll come forward and use the platform, that the awful platform that was created by this immense onslaught of online activity around her and global publicity around this case, to talk about why it needs to change. But that's a big ask for someone who's been traumatized in that way. And so through the work that I'm doing with the book and speaking about these issues, I have the benefit of experience of having worked with her and seen firsthand what this does. And I never want to see another woman go through it. And we have to do better than this. We have to do better than this. If we really want women to come forward and talk about what's happening, because we want to tackle the problem of violence against women, we have to make it easier.
Absolutely. I wonder, you talk about protection, and you've obviously, as we've discussed, looked after some very high-profile cases, and with high-profile cases becomes a lot of notoriety. and people have very strong opinions about, each side. How have you protected yourself?
It's a really good question, Sarah. So through the course of this case, I have been subjected to death threats, rape threats, awful images being sent to me, the online attacks towards me, which pale in comparison to what Amber suffered, does have a very real impact on you as a person. I am a lawyer, but I'm also a human who, when you pick up your phone and get sort of an onslaught of these kinds of attacks, it can be very difficult. So I think it's really important that we find support and solidarity amongst others who go through this. I think it's really important that people who are going through this have support, like trauma-informed support, therapy, professional support to get through these moments of publicity and online attacks. But we need to create a safer space for women online, and that to ensure women's public participation. So much of our lives is online now. So much of our public conversation happens online and in these social media spaces. And if we truly want the world to be equal and for women to participate equally, then we have to create safer spaces for that to happen. So for me, self-care is very important. And I say this to all lawyers I work with, junior and senior, and anyone I work with. When you're working on really difficult, traumatic subject matter, the secondary trauma is real, even as a lawyer, when you're dealing constantly with evidence of violence and human rights violations. So I'm very deliberate about taking care of myself and having time off and ensuring that I do things that I love and that I get joy from, and to keep a balance between the very serious nature of what I do day to day in my work and keeping a lightness and fun to my life that keeps that balance and keeps me going and gives me the energy to continue.
That's very, very needed. I wonder, for anyone listening, and especially any females who might have come across something in the workplace that's not right and they want to speak out about it, or even in a domestic situation, what are the first steps that someone should take? And especially if they feel like they're not in a role where they feel very powerful.
I think it's really important to acknowledge that I can't give advice. Every case is different and every case is individual. And one of the reasons we wrote this book is because we wanted to empower more women who could ever come into my offices with the kinds of risks and strategies that they need to be able to take on this kind of issue and make a decision about whether to speak out or not. And the decision to speak out publicly about your experience is a very personal one. I don't think any woman should feel a responsibility to necessarily speak publicly just to help others. It's a personal decision that women do make that decision to help others, but it has to be the right decision for you. But there are lots of legal risks involved. It's important to get specialist legal advice. And we hope, though, that the book contributes to helping people feel more empowered to make those decisions for themselves and to make them in a more safe, legally safe way. And so one of the wonderful things about this book is, and the feedback we've got from this book and that I'm so proud of, is that it's being used by survivors. And people have approached me at book events and said, thank you, you've empowered me to feel able to take this on in my own life. And it's not been easy, but this has empowered me to do so. And I feel great about that. And that's what we wanted with this book. But I do think it's very challenging, but I do recommend it is possible and you can take on the injustice in your life, get the support you need, and hopefully the contribution that we've made with the book helps to encourage more women to feel like they can do it.
What's some of the best advice that you have been given?
I think one of the best things, or best perspective someone's given me actually, is that we all have to do things for the first time once, if you know what I mean. Like everybody is just figuring things out. And particularly in my world where I'm working on quite controversial, high profile, often unprecedented sorts of cases, it helps to remind yourself of that. I think that remembering that everybody is just doing the best they can and everybody is having to make judgment calls and doing things for the first time. I say that to empower people to have a go at things, if you know what I mean. If I sat back, I think there's a tendency people sort of sit back and watch these things that I've done in my career and my cases and think, look what she's done. And actually, when you're confronted with these situations, you just have to get on with it and do the best you can. And I think remembering that is a really good reminder, I think, to just get in and have a go. But I also encourage women to think about, we self-select ourselves out of opportunities so often. And I really encourage women to always put your hat in the ring, because you never know what might happen. And because we have a tendency to self-select ourselves out when we should be pushing ourselves forward. And so I think overcoming that and making sure that you put yourself forward for things is really important. I wouldn't be where I am today if I hadn't.
That's very good advice. And our final question, Jennifer, what is a life of greatness to you?
A life of greatness to me is, as a lawyer, is defending those who speak truth to power and have the courage to stand up for others. That to me is living a life in a great way. I'm really privileged to work with the most amazing people who stand up and speak truth to power. And I think that is the theme of my practice as a lawyer too, in defending those people. And I think that is a life lived greatly.